In today's video, we're going to install a front locker into a Dana 30 out of a later model Jeep. But before we get started, I wanted to talk about some of the things Kaiser Willys has to offer. They specialize in 41 to 71 Jeep parts. That's what most people know them for, but they also carry many parts for later model Jeeps. So that 72 to 86, so the AMC era of Jeeps, and that's what we're working on today. This is a front differential out of a 1979 CJ5 that I'm putting in my flat fender. So I'm going to install this Lockrite locker. I got this from Kaiser Willys. So anytime you have a question about a part for a Jeep that maybe you don't see on their website, give them a call. Another thing, many of you with a keen eye may notice that this is an older Richmond Gear Lockrite box. Kaiser Willys also has an eBay store, so check this out. They have thousands and thousands of parts. Many are new old stock, many are kind of open box but brand new, and that's what this was. This came from their eBay store. I'll put a link in that to their in the description. So I didn't even know about that till recently. I was looking for this part, and I was on eBay, and I'm like, ooh, put that in my cart. And then I realized it said Kaiser Willys Auto Supply. So beyond what's on their website, they have thousands of incredible parts. Many are in old Jeep or Willys boxes, or just open box, older stocked parts like this. So make sure, always call them, check out their eBay store, and if you have an AMC Jeep also, shop by model. There are items on their website for that. So they have just a huge offering of parts and a wealth of knowledge, so make sure you check that out. I've done several different locker install videos on CJ2s and 3s before, so as far as the procedure for removing the hub and axle and getting the carrier out of the Jeep, that's not going to be covered in this video. If you click up here, there'll be a link to a previous video that shows that procedure. So we're going to assume we're starting with the differential in our hands or on the bench and go from there. Before we get started, we're going to talk about what tools you may need. This is actually a very simple procedure that doesn't really require anything that I would consider a specialty tool, just a few basic items. So obviously you need your locker and your differential. So this is just an open differential with the ring gear still on it, just as it would be coming out of your vehicle. You'd have bearings on here, but that won't affect this job. So I like to use an impact gun to take the ring gear off. You'll want an assortment of screwdrivers, picks, punches, things like that. So I just have some basic stuff here, a little flathead screwdriver, a center punch, a few drifts. I always recommend a brass drift. I don't have a small enough one for what we're doing today. Just some little picks and pokers like that. A hammer. I always like to use a brass hammer anytime I'm dealing with hardened steel or important machining parts. Micrometer, a torque wrench, and I like to use some type of Loctite. This is one of my favorites. It's the red Loctite stick. It's just a little easier to work with and less mess, but you may have a little tube of liquid or one of these little one-time use packs. Anyway is fine. You may opt for new ring gear bolts. That is personal preference. If you have them, it's probably best to use them. It also saves you from having to clean the threads of your old bolt. This is actually a really simple procedure that a lot of people are intimidated by because it deals with the gears and the differential and all that. But we're not affecting backlash or preload or anything. You're just removing it and reinstalling it. So you don't need a press or any specialty tools or knowledge to do this. All right, let's dig right in. So we're gonna flip over the differential and remove all the ring gear bolts. It's totally acceptable to use an impact gun for removing these. I like to mark the ring gear. It's good to put it back on in the same position that it came off. So I'm just going to take my center punch. The carrier is cast iron, so it will take a punch mark. And then the ring gear is hardened steel, so I wouldn't bother. You'll just break your punch. I just put a scratch in it. You can also just take a Sharpie and set it aside. We're not going to be really working with the ring gear, so the mark should stick around, no problem. Once all the bolts are out, it's sometimes good to have a piece of wood or a rag or something under there, because my workbench has a piece of metal on it. Sometimes when you take your last bolt off, the ring gear will fall off just like that. Other times it'll seem like it's really stuck on there, and you can just take a brass or rubber mallet and tap down. You'll have to alternate sides, maybe work your way around. What you don't want to do is take a chisel or a screwdriver and pry. You also don't want to use a steel hammer. This is a really important surface, and you don't want to mar it up or create burrs or damage the gear. Once the gear is off, put it someplace clean and safe, and we'll talk about the rest of that when we get to the reinstall. With the ring gear off, what's next is to remove this roll pin that holds the main shaft in, that holds the spider gears. So there's a little roll pin there. You'll notice it'll be flush on this side and recessed on here. It's just a small hole. So you want to go through the small hole. It'll push the pin the least distance as possible. Now, this would be a good time to use a brass drift. I don't have one that's small enough to go in there. Don't use a Phillips head screwdriver, because the tapered end of that will actually spread the roll pin and make it harder to punch out. So if you're like me and you don't happen to have the right tool on hand, a flat or blunt tip is best. So this little Torx bit fits right through there, and it really shouldn't come out hard at all. Just like that. There's the roll pin. If you damage it or it looks, you know, broken or marred up really bad, I would replace this. In this instance, this one looks fine, and it should have friction on it when it goes back in, because you obviously don't want that falling out. So I'm going to set that aside for later. Now it's time to remove the cross shaft, or the main pin. I always like to drive towards where we took the roll pin out. So the roll pin is on this side, so I'm going to drive that way. It will come out either way, but if there's ever a little burr or some piece of the roll pin on there, it's a very short trip out this way and a long trip the other way. So I'm using a brass drift. That pin is hardened, so you don't want to hit it with steel. Once the pin's out, take good care of that. Just set it to the side. Some lockers come with a new pin, some do not. This kit reuses the old pin, so I want to make sure that it stays clean and safe and I don't lose it. So now we just take a spider gear and roll it, and this little bottom and top gear will slide right out. So you'll get 2 gears and 2 of these coned washers, and you want to make sure you get everything out of the case, because we're not reusing any of these parts. So you can put them in a box if you need them later, but you won't need them once you have the locker installed. You're doing great. We're almost done with the disassembly. So now just wiggle the side gears out. There's one on both sides. And so this is the spline portion that actually engages the axle shaft, and on each one of them there will be a thrust washer. So these are important. We will reuse them. Inspect them for damage. You can clean the grease off of them so that grit and dirt doesn't stick to them, and then set them to the side. Sometimes they'll come out with the gear, other times they will get stuck to the case, and they're very small and thin, and sometimes they're hard to see. So make sure every differential should have one of these on both sides. These are available. You can purchase them in different thicknesses. Both of these measure about 28 thousandths. So there is a measurement we'll check at the end that can change based on which washers. And 99% of locker installs that I've done, the stock shims are acceptable and get reused. But anytime you tear one of these apart, I would hang on to these, because it stinks when you have to wait and order new shims because your locker install didn't go as planned. Now is a great time to clean and inspect your carrier. So it's a completely bare carrier now. There's nothing left in it, and that's how we want it. If you have a parts washer and you want to really make sure it's clean, that's a good time. Also, if there's any rust on it, a lot of times if your Jeep has sat, there'll be a line where the oil was and rust above that. You don't want any of that floating around in with your bearings and things like that. Also, if you have any burrs on here, I would file them off now because it's much easier to clean like this. This one seems perfect, so I'm not going to do anything to it. Also inspect it for cracks. I just worked on one earlier this week that had cracks, 4 cracks on all 4 corners right here from some type of abuse. So obviously, if that was the case with yours, you'd want to get a new carrier. Time to put some gloves on, and you're going to need these 2 pieces from your locker box. So these replace the side gears, the part that the axle slides into. So get those, and also your 2 side shims. Make sure they're both nice and clean and ready to go. Put them up there. They're hard to pick up with gloves. Then get yourself some grease. I always get a lot of flack for just using regular bearing grease for this. They do make specialty grease for assembling transmissions and differentials. If you have that, great, but I can tell you from personal experience, you're not going to hurt a darn thing by just using regular old grease. So don't let that stop you from getting the job done. So give that a nice coating of grease and slide one of your shims on there, and then another coating of grease on top of that. You don't need a ton, it doesn't need to be a 1/4 inch thick, just we're talking surface area here, so a thin coat on the entire surface is better than thick globs here and there. So repeat that step on the other side gear. Just a nice thin coating. If it's summer or really hot where you're doing this, you may want to put your grease in the refrigerator or freezer before you do this. It'll hold better because we're going to rely on the sticky factor to make this assembly process go smoother. So I put the other shim on there and greased that as well. Grab your carrier, position it however you would like. You can do this in a vise. It's a little easier for me to show you just here flat on the bench. So I'm taking 1/2 of the locker and just kind of fishing it in there, and I just kind of give a little pressure and a little wiggle, and that will hold it in place. Then turn it over like that. Here's where the sticky grease helps because it's not falling down on us. So got the other side gear with the shim, everything's clean, and I'm just wiggling it. Give it a little pressure, a little spin. Grab the 4 remaining pieces out of your box, and I like to get a little cup of some sort because you're going to get a little baggie with very small pins and springs, and you need every single one of them. There are no extras, so don't lose them. And with this grease and gloves on, I kind of feel like a Butterfingers. So I always use something. This is an old measuring cup, but a little magnetic tray would be even better. For this next part, you're going to notice each half has a window on it. So there's an oblong window and a round window. And we're going to install the little pins into the oblong window. You'll see why in a second here. So take a pin, there's no left and right, they're just tapered slightly on both ends. Get a little grease on it and slide it into the oblong window. And why that's important is because we need this pin to be completely flush. So you see if we stick it in this one, it protrudes, and that's a no-go for us. So you'll put a little bit of grease on it and stick it right down in there, and the grease just keeps the pin from falling out, so you really don't need much at all. So it should look like that. It should be completely flush. Get your other housing. You can put the grease on the pin or just in the opening of the hole. I'm just going to do it that way so I can wipe my finger off. Should make my kids come out here and hand me parts. So another pin in the oblong hole. Push it flush. Make sure you don't lose any of those little springs in your bowl. And another pin. So all 4 pins are in the oblong hole, 2 on each side. Now it's time to install the gear and the spacer. So I'll start with this bottom one here. This can be a little tricky because things are going to move around on you, but once you get it in place, you'll be fine. So if you notice, there's flats cut on each side. They have to go in that way because they obviously won't fit like that. You're also going to take your spacer, and this is the orientation that it should go in. So it's like a cup. So picture your axle reaching into that side. So, and this is how it goes. So just keep that in mind. If you do mess it up and put it in wrong, you can take it back out. Nothing's permanent here. So just slide that in, and it should be just like that. It may fall out, it may not. So I'll take my other one, exactly the same, and this is a little tight, but it should drop right in there. Alright, I actually ran into a little snafu there, if you noticed a pause in filming, and that was I couldn't get the top piece into the carrier because it wouldn't fit through the web. So I'll show you exactly what that was and what I did to get around it. So this is what it should look like. You want your pins lined up. Remember, the spacers are in there just like I showed you. And then you're going to rotate this around. This part is a little tricky because it's going to want to collapse on itself, but we're going to rotate it around to where the pin opening lines up. I don't know if you can see in there. And we're going to install the pin. So you remember where the roll pin hole is. You got to do your best to line that up. So make sure that the pin is perpendicular, you know, or is lined up with the hole. You know what I mean. So I'm just going to get it started by hand, and I'll use my brass hammer and just start tapping it in place. You may have to stick your finger in the locker and just keep wiggling it around. Don't hit it hard. If you're having to hit it hard, that means it's not lined up. There, it's starting to go. Alright, it was a bit of a juggling act, but I finally got it. If your pin rotates at all while you're doing this, just stick another pin or something in there, and you can rotate it until it's pretty much all the way in. And then you just gently tap it, looking down the hole. The hole is tapered, so if you're off a tiny bit, when you drive the roll pin in, it will straighten it up. Okay, so there it is. That's what it should look like. These will clank around a little bit because the springs aren't engaged yet. I mentioned I had a little snafu getting the locker in the case, and that led me to wanting to stop and explain to you what I meant. So I have two different carriers here. This one on the left, they're both Dana 30s. The one on the left is for, I believe it's 272 to 373 gears. So this is probably the most common ratio is 354 for CJ5 and 7 from the early to late 73 to 79. They pretty much all had this 354 ratio with this carrier. And then as I'm doing the locker install, I'm also switching to 488 gears. So this is a 373 and up gear ratio carrier. And as I'm putting the top piece in, it wouldn't fit in. And if you notice, this opening is a different shape than this one. It's a little more rounded in the corners. It's thicker cast, and a lot of the size difference has to do with the thickness of the ring gear. The distance from here to here is the same, and the ring gear diameter is the same, but the distance, because the ring gear thicknesses are different between ratios. So you may encounter this if you had a 373 or higher gear ratio. It would have this opening, and it would have slid right in. But with whatever year, I don't know what year Dana 30 this came out of. It might be a Commando or something from the early 70s. It just had a different web casting, and there was some buildup of casting in the corners. So I had to take the power file and buzz these corners a little bit. I tried to remove as little as possible. I took everything back out and wiped the grease off so that it wouldn't collect any chips, and I just filed these corners. I tried to keep them as round as possible because I really didn't want to create a weak spot. I probably removed a 1/16 of an inch from both sides, and then it slid right in. So hopefully you won't have to do that. I'm taking some other measurements to make sure everything else is the same, but the install procedure does not change. But most likely, most of you are going to have this larger opening. On with the show. So we have one more step. It's a little tricky to, especially if you have big clumsy fingers. We're going to install the little springs. So what you want to do is take the large spring and slide the smaller spring inside of it. Then we're going to come over to the oblong window. You have to line the two halves up so that the pin will slide up into that other side. Then I found it helpful to take some kind of wedge and stick it into there. This is a body panel pry bar from Harbor Freight. It won't scratch anything, and it kind of has the right taper. And then you simply slide that in the hole, and you can use a pick or a little flathead screwdriver, seems to work well. And you just kind of smush it down in there, both springs, so one inside the other. And they should kind of snap down in there when they're in the right spot. There, my wedge fell out. There you go. So once it's in correctly, it should snap in and be straight. If it's all coiled up in there, you might have it kinked. And the flat screwdriver allows you to kind of compress it and get it straightened out. So once you get one in, you don't need the wedge anymore, because that spring will kind of force the two halves apart. And then you just come over here to the other side. The pick works really well to slide the pin over. Once you have one in, the alignment will kind of stay where it's supposed to be, and it's really easy once you get the first one in. Once you get it, the front edge of it started down in the hole. Sometimes I make things look more difficult than they really are, but if it makes you feel any better, I've done this a bunch of times, and this backside spring always gives me a little bit of grief. Oop, there we go. So now that I have the front side in, we're on the home stretch. So you just want to feed it down in there, and at least with this one, if it shoots out, it just hits that ring gear. It doesn't generally go flying. And then just work it down in, just like that, and it will kind of snap in place once you know you got it right. And I like to, like I said, kind of depress it a few times and make sure the little spring stays inside the big spring. So I already got the easy one done there, and you just repeat that step 4 times. Don't lose your spring, and you'll be good to go. Okay, that's it. Really make sure the springs are down in there. I haven't put the roll pin in yet because we have one more step. If I do need to take it apart, I don't want to have to take that roll pin in and out a whole bunch of times. The last step before we are really done is to now check this gap measurement. So remember I talked about those thrust washers being different thicknesses. They can be worn or broken. Your case can be worn just from years of spinning, and we don't want that, but we really won't know until you measure it. So what you want to do is take, if you have a feeler gauge that's that large, you could do that, but just a pair of dial micrometers like this will do the trick. We're looking between 153 thousandth to a max of 170 thousandths. So this is kind of the test. And check it in a few different spots. All right, so I'm right at like 168 to 170 thousandths. We'll check the other side. Both sides should be the same. 169. 166, 167. So it's right at the upper limits of the tolerance, but that's pretty much where all the ones I've done are. I've never had any that are too tight. So if it was too thin, you could get a different thickness shim, or a lot of people just go with it and see what happens. A lot of people ask me, do these click and bang and slip and things like that? I've never had an issue with them. I've put them in, that's what I have in all my Jeeps, front and rear. And but other people I've been with have some pretty noisy lockers, or ones that disengage when they're, you know, crawling. I don't know if this measurement affects that much. I think the main thing is that there's enough gap there so that when you go around a corner, it will push up out of these splines and release. So I would think being too tight is a bigger problem than being too loose. So I'm okay with 168. We're going to call it good and do the final step, which is to install the roll pin. If you remember, we drove the roll pin out from here to there. So when we reinstall it, we want to start it here and push it down. So you want to make sure you should be able to see daylight right through that hole. So if you can see all the way through, that means your pin is lined up correctly. That's it. I drove it down till it's just below the top of this. That means it's plenty far through the hole. So that locker is installed, and this carrier is now ready for the ring gear. Here's my ring gear. I take some parts cleaner, then spray everything down. I did both sides just in case any dirt got anywhere. Maybe take off your gloves and check it for burrs. The same thing for this. This one may even be brand new. It looks in really good shape. So remember, we made a mark on that, and on the case, which it's right here, the bolt holes are pretty far apart, so you're gonna very easily know that you have the right hole, the right, you know, alignment. So there's my old mark and the ring gear, and they're nice and lined up. It's really important that your threads are clean, because we're going to use Loctite on these bolts, and we don't want that to be you know, full of dirt or oil or anything like that. As I said in the beginning of the video, if you have new bolts, why not use them? But I have many times reused them. These aren't stretch bolts like on a modern car. They're just, I don't know if they're grade 8 or 10, but they're just a standard bolt. And then I'm putting some red Loctite on them. I don't plan on taking this off anytime soon. The red Loctite requires heat for removal. I like to go through and put the Loctite on all of them before I start, so that I don't have to stop and smear it on there when I'm in the middle of torquing. My bolts are ready. This ring gear fits on here really nicely. I'm able to rotate it. Some of them are super tight, and if you don't line the holes up when you slide it on, it's really hard to get them started. So I'm starting them by hand. I always start each one, at least a few threads, by hand. It's a very fine thread. The gear is a very hard material, and so are the bolts, so it's really unlikely that you'll cross thread these, but I'm sure it has been done. I like to kind of keep some pressure squeezing up on the gear when I'm doing this, because it will try to walk off the carrier, and then you'll have trouble getting them started. While I'm still squeezing it, I'm going to take my impact gun and just run one down. Now you can stand it up like this and it won't fall off. Now I'm using an impact gun with a chrome socket, don't worry. I'm not torquing them. It's just a fine thread, and it saves some time. It's best to kind of jump around and make sure it's going evenly. But usually once you get too snugged up, you're good to go. So like I said, I'm just using this to save time. In one of my videos, I said finger tight with an impact gun, and I got a lot of flack for that, but chances are, if you've been working on stuff, you know what finger tight with an impact gun means. Okay, so now they're all on there. I like to look here and make sure that it's not on crooked. It's such a tight tolerance with the hole and the ring gear, the shoulder it sits on. I would be shocked if it's crooked at this point, since all the bolts are down tight. Last step, if you have soft jaws for your vise, that's great. If not, just put a rag in there, set it down flush, and you don't have to crank it. I mean, it's really not, you're not putting a ton of torque on this. So get it situated in your vise with something down to prevent any marring or scratching. And now we're going to torque this with a torque wrench. I always recommend consulting the service manual for the specific vehicle you're working on. The manual for this says 55 foot-pounds. So I don't go straight to 55. I set the wrench at 55, but I'm just using feel and doing kind of a star pattern to kind of just snug all of them without making it click, if that makes sense. I'm just kind of going around. You could definitely set it to like 30 and go through and click them all at 30, but you'll kind of get a feel. I'm just making them probably about 30 foot-pounds to start. Okay, now we're gonna go for the final torque. And I'm gonna jump around in a star pattern to 55 foot-pounds. That's it. You just successfully installed the front locker in your Dana 30 differential carrier. So if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below and I'll answer them as best I can or get you the information you need. Remember to check out Kaiser Willys' eBay store and also give the office a call if you ever have a part that you can't find. Remember to follow Kaiser Willys on all social media platforms. They have regular sales and discount codes as well as featuring new products. Thanks for watching. Catch you later.